This is the story of Australia and its formation in the supercontinent cycle over the last 2 billion years. Its story is the story of Uluru and its formation. So let's have a look at how Australia was actually formed. We begin, as we always do, 2 billion years ago with the formation of Western Australia, North Australia and South Australia. And this is how it begins. We have the Pilbara coming in during the supercontinent cycle of Nuna, about 1.8 to 1.5 billion years ago, and during that time as well we also have the Pilbara coming in, and they came in from previous supercontinent cycles, from separate supercontinents in fact, and they came together and they essentially formed Western Australia. And this occurred actually a little bit before Nuna, about 2.1 billion years ago, and essentially formed in this direction from the south towards the north and started moving around here. Now, going into the business end of Nuna, we have the formation of the Northern Territory, essentially from north to south in many different formations as South Australia was being pushed in from a different part. That created lots of orogenies and events over that period of time of 1.8 to 1.5 billion years ago. And I'm going to represent it with this particular beautiful piece of sedimentary layer there. So that is essentially here. So the Northern Territory, obviously it looks bigger than the other parts there. I couldn't find any other suitable rock, but this is actually quite beautiful, and it's actually a really important part of our story there. So that was formed during Nuna. They all started to move in during Nuna, but they didn't necessarily form or amalgamate as one coherent mass as yet. That happened in the next supercontinent, Rodinia, and Rodinia is a supercontinent that definitely was recognisable as a supercontinent about 1.1 billion years ago, and lasted about at least 200, maybe 300 million years. And during that time of Rodinia, all these pieces came together, and you have South Australia, or the South Australian Craton, West Australian Craton and North Australian Craton coming together, and in doing so they essentially created Central Australia, and in doing so it also created the tectonic setting for Uluru and Karajuta and its formation to occur 500 million years later. Now, you might have noticed that it's not entirely complete Australia. It's only 2/3 of Australia. So 2/3 of Australia was formed during Nuna and Rodinia. The rest of it will form during Gondwana and Pangaea. But not quite yet, not there yet. This is an interesting part of the story. As Rodinia split up, we had the elements of Rodinia head off in one direction, and the other elements of Eurasia and North America head off in the other direction. And then they came together to form Pangaea. But before that, Gondwana formed West Gondwana, East Gondwana came together, and about 580 million years ago, and that sutured together over about 50 million years. But at the same time, the Petermann Ranges was formed by the Petermann orogeny, and this is how it happened. And this is new information. Now, if you're a tool guide, this is something that you should pay attention to. Traditionally, we would say that it was a compression from east and west, but it's actually something far more simple, more elegant, and perhaps more beautiful as well. Essentially, when India came in to move in as a part of Gondwana, it kicked and moved a part of Australia, and it essentially rotated the North Australian Craton relative to the amalgamation of South Australia and Western Australia, and it rotated at 40 degrees like this, and now you're starting to see that it resembles Australia today. Now, there's a point just north of Alice Springs, south of Tennant Creek, called the Euler Pole, and essentially the craton pivoted around this. So it pivoted as India came in. That's one idea. There's lots of speculative ideas actually as to how that actually happened. But in doing so, you can see that created a lot of friction. Mountains were thrown up as this was pushed and rotated around. As you can see some of the sand coming up, and that threw up the Peterman ranges, and that created the sedimentary material that we see at Uluru and Karajuta. Now, the best analogy or contemporary analogy of that is way off in New Zealand. If you have a look at the South Island, we've got the Transalpine Fault, which creates those incredible mountains that we have in the South Island. Another analogy is the San Andreas Fault, which shifts like this, and in doing so creates interesting mountains. The San Gabriel Mountains is a good example. A lot of tour guides refer to the Himalayas, and that's not necessarily correct. Probably I would use the the Southern Alps of South Island, New Zealand, as your best analogy as to what those mountains would have liked. It's the same mechanism. Anyway, that's what happened during the amalgamation of Gondwana. It twisted and rotated 40 degrees and threw up the Peterman Ranges there. The story's not over yet, as you can see. We've got the rest of Australia to create, and it was during the time of Gondwana that the rest of Australia was formed. Gondwana started to form about 580 million years ago. Pretty much broke up about 80 million years ago. So Gondwana bridges over Pangaea, so it's quite a sizable part of the supercontinent cycle there. Anyway, during that time, very, very briefly, Gondwana created lots of subduction and interesting orogenies and collision events along here, not too dissimilar to what we have along the Andes, and in doing so created and stuck material on the rest of Australia and formed the rest of it very, very briefly. And I'm just going to tack in a part of that. That will be Tasmania a little bit later, and you can start to see the outline of Australia. You have Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, parts of South Australia here, Tasmania, and it started to come into its own as Gondwana, or Pangaea rather, broke up and created Australia as we see it today. So we have the map of Australia going around the Gulf of Carpentaria, Darwin, the Kimberley, down in Pilbara, Western Australia, that interesting part of Western Australia coming in along the Nullarbor Plain, the Great Australian Bight, and around Tasmania. And so this is essentially the formation of Australia over the last two supercontinents, Pangaea, Gondwana. This part of Australia was formed. Previous to that, during Nuna and Rodinia, this was part. So Australia was formed in this fashion, sort of going up and across over the last 2 billion years, and over the last 4 supercontinents, Nuna, Rodinia, Gondwana and Pangaea, and essentially we're heading into the next supercontinent, Amasia. Now it's speculated that maybe 60, 70 million years we'll be heading into anywhere between Japan and Vietnam and into China, and forming our own Himalaya-esque mountains there, and that's going to bode an interesting story, I suppose, for Uluru and Karajuta. What's going to happen there? Maybe they'll be buried with huge amounts of sediments coming in from those future mountain ranges. Who knows? So that's the formation of Australia.